Hey everyone, John here. Welcome back to another Sapphire tutorial. This time I'm going to break down how I created this look in After Effects using this dramatic looking dragon egg I created in Blender with a lot of Sapphire and a sneaky little guest appearance from Continuum. So let's jump in. So this entire look was created using the majority of Sapphire effects, and as I mentioned, a couple of Continuum effects, and no stock footage, nothing else. The only footage I've got is the render out of Blender, which is the dragon egg. So let's break it down. At the very bottom, I have Sapphire's gradient radial effect, and you can see this is like a teal color, which I've pulled across to the right-hand side. So it's kind of like some blue light coming in from the side. And above that, another Sapphire gradient radial effect. This time I kind of burned orange, and this is across to the left. So it's giving us that orange teal look, which is always a good look. Now, to add the smokiness, I've used Sapphire Clouds Perspective, and I'm not actually using it for the clouds look. It's more of a rising smoke look. And to find that, what I did was I used Sapphire's Sapphire Effect or S effect. And if you've watched any of my tutorials, you'll know that when I'm using Sapphire, I use a lot of presets, and in order to browse all of the presets across all of the effects, I use Sapphire Effect because that allows me to do that. So by clicking on Load Preset, that opens up the preset browser, and I searched for clouds because originally I wanted to have like a interesting looking cloud background for this. So I typed in clouds, and that gave me various different cloud backgrounds. And the one I chose was this one here, Dark Sky Clouds Perspective. And originally I thought this was actually going to be the look I was going to go with. It has this perspective to it, and I thought maybe this could give my look a little bit of depth. So I chose that one. Now, what I could have also done here is maybe looked for smoke. If I decided that I was going to, create a smoky look at first, I would have done that. And there's various looks that are very similar to what I ended up with. You can see rising smoke here using Cloud Psycho. And there's this smoldery one using S Cloud. So there's a few different varieties of rising smoke. But I chose S Cloud's Perspective. And let's take a look at that. So I'm just going to solo that, and here's the finished look. You've got this sort of boiling, smoky look. Now, the reason we have that boiling is because I've checked boiling mode. If I uncheck that, you get more of that sort of classic, streaky clouds look. Although I have got the movement going up on the Y. See, you can see shift speed on the Y is set to -50. And that's moving upwards. But by choosing boiling mode and adjusting the boil speed and the boil details, you can get that smoky look. Originally, it had a little bit of perspective to it. So that was the latitude. You can see that gives you more of a cloudy look, a cloud-like look. And I quite like that as well, but in the end, it wasn't the look that I went with. So by setting that to screen, and also the gradient radial, the orange gradient radial to screen, that combines all of those three together. So we have that look. So using Sapphire instead of stock footage to create smoke is really useful. All right, so above that we have this dragon egg layer. Now we're going to skip that for a moment because we're going to come back to that. And I want to take a look at the actual footage. So this is the render out of Blender. And you can see in Blender I've lit it on the left-hand side with that sort of orange light. And I've lit it on the right-hand side with the blue light. And just done a simple camera animation where the camera pulls back and the egg is rotating. Now, if you'd like to learn how I created that egg, you can check out my personal YouTube channel, and I've got a tutorial there on how to model that dragon egg in Blender. So by all means, check that out. Now, I did also texture this in Substance Painter as well, because I wanted this to have a feel of some sort of, mythical dragon kind of scale look. So it's got a kind of a metallic feel to it, a little bit grungy, a little bit dirty. Didn't take too long to texture that, just a couple of hours. All right, so that's the egg. And if we just turn on these layers, we've got this look. One thing I did do to the egg was just apply Sapphire's sharpen effect. You can see by turning that off, it's a little bit soft. This just, gives it a little bit more detail and just helps it sort of pop out a little bit, makes it look a little bit more metallic by using sharpen. Now, let's come back to this one here, this dragon egg layer. I'm going to solo this. So this is what I use to create the flames. Let's just turn on this one here. See how we get these really lovely flames coming out the side? And these are obviously not realistic flames, not super realistic. They're more stylized. I want to show you how I built those. So I'll turn that one off again. And there's a bunch of effects in here. Let's check this out. So one thing to notice is I do have a mask on that layer. You can see I've just masked it off because I didn't want the effect to be popping out down the bottom here. So as I was exploring this look, the first thing I started with was S rays, so sapphire rays, and that gives me that kind of look. So with S rays, key things to point out here, it's pretty simple. I didn't do too much to it. The main thing is I've used atmosphere. If I bring that to 0, that's what we have. So the sort of classic rays look, but I wanted to have a more smoky feel to this to sort of, match what I had created with Cloud's perspective. And that's the sort of style that we have. And you can see that atmosphere also has an atmosphere speed setting. You zoom in here. It also has a kind of boiling look to it as well, which matches the boil mode in Cloud's perspective. So that was the first effect. And below that, I've used Sapphire's distort blur effect. And at this stage, I wasn't really trying to create fire. I was just trying to create something interesting behind the egg. And I originally used Sapphire Distort, and it didn't quite give me the look that I wanted. And I tried S Blur, and it was a little more, it's a little more smeary. S Distort Blur. It gives a bit more of a smeared look. And when I applied that, I thought, it's starting to look like fire. So I decided to explore that a little further. After that, I've applied Sapphire Rays again. And that's made that a little brighter. And you can see a little more streaky. It's starting to look a little more like fire. And that also has the atmosphere amount increased as well. You can see it's just adding some more atmosphere in, giving it a bit more depth and layering it up. You can see how fast these effects are as well. I'm going to bring it back to my original setting. Now, at this point, I was searching through the Sapphire Distort category, trying to find something that would make it look a little more like fire. And I couldn't really find what I was looking for, so this is where Continuum came in, my favorite curl effect. So Continuum's got a really interesting distortion. This curl effect has a really interesting distortion where it curls the layer, it distorts the layer into curls. And this was, I've thought, really starting to look a little more like you'd see with sort of stylized fire. So let's just turn that egg back on. So we started to get that kind of look, right? So as it pulls back, it looks a little more sort of smoky, fiery kind of look. So curl really helped with this. Now, while I was reviewing this morning before recording, I was thinking, I wonder if there's something else in Continuum or Sapphire that I could use to add even more detail. And I didn't put this in the final render, but check this out. I've used BCC Turbulence. And if I turn that on, look at that. It just starts to bend that in a little more interesting way just by using Turbulence. And see, you can see it there. So without, it's more curled and smooth, but with a bit of BCC Turbulence, it just breaks it up. Makes it look a little more jagged, a little more angry, a little more fiery. So I actually quite like that. I think that really helps. So I was just playing around with the, with the master displacement. Try not to put too much in there, not too little. Just a little bit to sort of add a bit more angle. Some interesting angles in there as well. So BCC Turbulence. So I do like that a lot. I think that really does look like stylized fire. And it's nice because the egg is animated to pull back. As it pulls back, the fire obviously, moves back as well, and it kind of follows the egg. And I just want to give you a little bit of insight into the design of this. Originally, I was thinking maybe I could have the egg crack open and, and have fire come out and particles. And in the end, I thought, no, because, these are kind of, it's strong dragon scales. It just doesn't hatch that way. And I couldn't think of a way to make it look any good. So it worked out pretty well because I was able to sort of add the fiery look that I was kind of going for, but not coming out of the egg, but kind of behind the egg. So the feel is there without having to, get too complicated with this. Okay, so here's the look so far. And you can already see it's already got a load of depth to it. And speaking of depth, notice how the sides of the egg are out of focus. And I've used depth of field in Blender to render that out. So we really focus in on these scales right in front of the camera. Thought that was really dramatic. But see how the background is in focus? And I thought that didn't match. So to get around that, I've used an adjustment layer with Sapphire's rack defocus effect. So I'll turn that on. And you see how we're just blurring out the background there? So defocusing it to match the sides of the eggs or the back of the egg. And that way we're getting a lot more focus here on the foreground. Without that, that kind of breaks that. So we're getting sort of focus here and focus there without it. And I didn't like that. So I just added a couple of keyframes to that. So it's out of focus at the start and it starts to come into focus as the egg moves back, because you don't see as much depth of field when the egg's further back in the frame there. So a little further away. So that's how I got around that. So just matching that with a simple adjustment layer with rack defocus. Now, also while we're talking about depth, something that really helps add depth is a little bit of dust. So for that, I've used the Sapphire dust effect. And I'm going to turn on, first of all, let's see, we'll turn on the one that's behind the egg. That's this one here. So I'll just solo that. So we've got some, I said dust, but actually we've got some falling embers here. So there's a preset in Sapphire dust presets that's called embers or falling embers. And I've used that one. And once again, I use Sapphire effect to search for what I wanted. It's actually called Gentle Ember Shower. That's what it's called. And dust itself doesn't have motion blur currently. So you can see I've used Force Motion Blur effect just to give it a little more of an ember look. When you've got really slow drifting dust, you don't really need motion blur. But when you've got things like embers and stuff, motion blur really helps. You can see how it stretches, that circular shape, that round shape, into more of a sort of a falling ember look. So we've got this, gently drifting or gently falling embers behind the egg, which is really nice. But what I also did was I duplicated that layer and I put that in front of the egg. And you can see I've really maxed out the depth of field. Let me just solo that. So here we've got a few less particles. I've called them particles, but they're points with Sapphire dust. And what I've done is I've really pumped up the depth of blur, the depth blur amount. If I bring that to 0, you can start to see more of them in the background. But with a high depth blur amount, you can see I've really got these ones in the foreground here. And I can adjust, how many I see in the foreground by adjusting the near plane and also the near plane fade. So I can fade that in and out. And, there's a whole bunch of settings for the box depth, and there's tutorials that I've already created that explains this in detail. But here, so I've just used 2. So I've sandwiched the egg between 2 versions of dust so that we have these ones, which are also, by the way, falling faster. The drift speed is set to 422. So because they're in the foreground, you'd expect them to be, they're closer to the camera, so they look like they're falling faster. So that's why I increased that drift speed. So even without the background, the other background layers, you can see how that gives that a whole bunch of depth. Foreground, midground, background. Let's turn these other layers back on. And it really is starting to come together. Sapphire dust is great because it's really fast. It's not a particle effect, and it doesn't require any caching. So it's very easy to use, very fast to use for anything like dust and embers and snow and that kind of thing. Brilliant addition to the Sapphire Effect portfolio, the Sapphire Effect toolbox. All right, so let's move up. We've almost finished the actual look of the egg. The last layer here is Ultra Glow. So Sapphire Ultra Glow, you can see I've used a mask. When you're creating any kind of fiery or bright element like a lens flare or fire behind an object, you would expect there to be a little bit of leak, or light wrap around the foreground object. So a quick way to do that is just to use a glow. So I just use Ultra Glow. If I turn that on, you can see now we get that, because it's on an adjustment layer above everything, we get that bleed of light, and that gives it a lot of depth as well. It's just a classic compositing trick, using a glow on top, and that really integrates that fiery look. Makes it feel more like it's coming from the egg. And the reason I masked it off is because I didn't want to have it down here as well and start to glow this out. Just kept it there. Now there are a couple of other final layers above, Ultra Grain and Color Fuse. We'll look at those in a moment, but let's look at the text treatment. So I'm going to go into my Dragon Egg base comp, and this is the name Dragon Egg. And the font here is from the Adobe fonts. It's called Banshee. I thought this was really good. It's got a kind of, really suitable sort of slightly angular, jagged look. This is a really great pointy G, just like a dragon scale or a dragon tooth. So this was a perfect font for this look. And also, importantly, it's actually fairly readable. So Banshee. And to that, I've applied another sneaky little continuum effect, BCC Grunge. Let's turn that off. So there's the white text. Now with BCC Grunge applied, I've used the VV Microscopic Bubbles texture. Okay, and I've also turned on erosion. I wanted the text to be revealed in a interesting way, but rather than just using a transition or a wipe with a mask, I wanted to kind of have it sort of burn on, give a feeling that it was sort of burning on, and that's why I used erosion. You can see I've added a couple of keyframes to the amount. And I've used the texture here. I could use a layer from After Effects if I wanted to for this. This is a great little feature in Grunge, being able to animate the erosion based on an image map. So just have that come on like that. And we come back to the main comp. I'm going to solo this, and we're going to go through this layer by layer. So this is the bottom of the Dragon Egg text. And you can see it's basically just smoky, just smoke really. So here, there's the layer we just looked at. And to this I've applied Sapphire Texture Flux. So Texture Flux is kind of a liquid feel to it, and it has some animation in here, which is the morphing. So it's just giving us some bright and dark areas that are animating in a nice organic way. And above that, I've applied Ultra Glow, and Ultra Glow also has atmosphere. So without atmosphere, we get this. So we're getting just a nice sort of glowy look, and you can see the glow is moving around because of the texture flux. So the bright areas get become brighter because of the glow. But with atmosphere, it's more of a smoky look. So we get this kind of look that this is kind of like smoke, and there's flames somewhere that are kind of lighting up the smoke. That's the kind of look I was going for. So that's the bottom layer for the text. Above that, we have the actual text reveal. So here we have Simple Choker, which I'll tell you about why I use that in a moment. So once again, Texture Flux and Ultra Glow. But here with the Ultra Glow, what I've turned on, importantly, is edges. So if I turn that off, so we lose the effect pretty much completely. And that's based on the settings that I've set in here. But with Edge Detect, it's detecting the edge of that text. And we're getting this really lovely, brighter, edges where that texture flux is brighter. And once again, also here using Atmosphere. So a great way to make that stand out in a really interesting way. You can see how when that erosion reveals the text, we get that kind of look, which is really nice. And you've got the atmosphere here, but with the layer below it, we get a bit more, and it's a little bit more readable. I think that's why I added that. It just adds an extra level of readability to this. So Ultra Glow with edges, great for text and logos. And I actually really liked this. I thought this was starting to look really good. Let's just turn on these other layers. So we got that. And I think that's pretty readable. And I couldn't decide in the end whether I wanted to go with just that or I wanted to make it, even more readable. So I ended up going for a slightly more readable look. And that's why I used a white layer. Let me just solo that. So once again, this is the same pre-comp with the same BCC Grunge reveal, but just with some white fill. And notice also that I've offset it. So it's starting a little later. So we have this text drawing on a little earlier. And then by offsetting it, we start to get the white text revealing. I just felt that, I'm going to turn these off. I just felt that having it all reveal at the same time, having the white text reveal at the same time wasn't quite as interesting, it wasn't as dynamic. So I decided to just offset the white so it gives me an extra level of reveal. So we get a little bit of this action going on and we get to see that before it gets covered up by the white text. Now, you can see as it's wiping on, it looks a little bland. What I wanted to have was some more sort of fiery edges. So what I did was I duplicated the white text. Let me just solo these. So I filled it again, but this time with this bright, sort of really, bright, vivid orange. And then I've used Set Matte. So After Effects has Set Matte effect with it matting itself. So it's basically just applying Set Matte and leaving it at that. And what that does is it just leaves the edges of the layer. So there is a little sort of edge effect that we get with that. Then applying Sapphire Rays to give it a bit of sort of directional rays, which wasn't strong enough, so I applied rays again and got that. And what happens is when we turn the white text on, see how we get this kind of leading edge? So as that's being revealed, we're getting a more flamey look. And this is also sort of, when I turn on the egg, this is also kind of giving me that look that I wanted to kind of get by having, fire come out of the egg. I talked about before, having it hatch and have, rays of fire sort of coming out of it. So this kind of emulated that, but by using it on the text, not on the egg. I think that makes a big difference. So we've moved towards the end here. We've got this kind of look. We've got this white text with this sort of beautiful ultra glow fiery edge to it. Now notice how we do have this horrible edge here, and this is why I've used the simple choker. So on this layer here, I've just choked this back a little bit, just choked it back and got rid of all of that. So that's why I use that effect. All right, so we're almost there. Studios is just Studios, just the word Studios in Trajan, which you've got to use, it's got that classic, epic movie feel to it. And also, why Dragon Egg Studios? I don't know. I just thought maybe this could be, when you see at the beginning of a feature film where the different film studios, they have the little animation. This could be one of those kind of animations. So I call this Dragon Egg Studios. Maybe this studio does a lot of fantasy films or something. When you create this kind of look, it's up to you to use your imagination, right? Now, to finish off the entire look, what I've done is I've used a little bit of Sapphire Color Fuse. You can see there. So just increases the contrast. Now, with Color Fuse, all I do literally is load a preset. I grab an adjustment layer, stick it at the top, take a look at the presets, and click through the different presets until I find something that I like, and just go with that. I really don't do any more than that with Color Fuse. Ben has made so many great presets that I can just click on them and just cycle through until I find something that really works with my shot. And that's what I did. So I grabbed a bit of Color Fuse there, just like that. Very nice. And a little bit of Ultra Grain just at the top. So Sapphire Ultra Grain. All I did was grab one of the fine presets and just decrease the, I think, grain amplitude. And we just add a little bit of grain. Grain's always great. You can see it there. Always great to sort of bring looks together, because everything obviously below the adjustment layer gets the grain, and it gives it a more sort of filmic look. So a finished filmic look. All right, so that's how I use Sapphire with a little bit of Continuum in After Effects to create this epic dragon egg look. Hopefully you found that useful. To learn more about Sapphire, Continuum, and all of the Boris FX suite, visit borisfx.com, where you can also download a free trial. For now, this is John. I'll see you in the next tutorial.